thing that's happened is that it's linked the world together so that the silos have broken down, not just between organizations, not just between economic areas, not just between domestic and international politics and between nations, but the entire world is now living, in other words, in this giant roiling mess. We see this in our social media feeds, those of us who have them, and those of us who don't still get a sense that everything is now interconnected. We all know the butterfly effect. That seemed like news, oh my God, chaos, when you could have butterfly wings here and it creates some giant effect in there. Now we're living that every day. Our daily newspapers are filled with events across the world and across the spheres, and we see them affecting us directly and often our engagement with them. All the various news events, many of the various news events that we have been grappling with, and the issues that have been talked about here at the center over the last decade, and the ones that are on the agenda today, are in many respects derivative of that. There's obviously a continuity to international relations, but there's this broader trend line of change that's occurring. And so the events, even the sort of seemingly straightforward, old-fashioned type events like a geopolitical conflict in Ukraine or barbarism in the Middle East, can in fact be seen as playing out against a very new backdrop and driven by these larger trends. What are some of the lessons for policy, not just substance, that we've learned? Well, I think that I would highlight three broad categories of lessons. The first is what the president so aptly said as don't do stupid shit. Which he's gotten a lot of grief for, but I think that's actually a very important lesson. It may not be all of wisdom, as Hillary Clinton tried to point out recently, but it's a pretty good start. And not creating giant own goals, not messing things up, taking a Hippocratic oath view of policy, first doing no harm, is not a bad way to start. There have been so many mistakes, so much hubris, so much negative action across the last decade and a half that I think policymakers stopping digging and generally thinking, being more careful before they act, and avoiding clearly ill-fated endeavors driven to them by either simplicity or ideology or politics or short-term thinking would really be an appropriate starting place for future lessons. And there, this is not controversial. Things like knowing what you want to achieve before starting down a particular course of action. War being a perfect example. I say in my book, the one simplest lesson from my book on how wars end, which usually is badly, but the lesson for the future is, instead of thinking of war as a sort of sequence of events, so 1, 2, 3, 4. In Iraq, we famously call it the post-war world, and the post-conflict planning as a phase 4 planning for stability operations. I said, if you think of it more like a moonshot, like a countdown, and so you're doing 4, 3, 2, 1, and you start with the outcome that you want, and reverse engineer that, and try to make your actions lead to that outcome, you'd be much better off. And I think that kind of, knowing what you want to achieve at the end before you go in the beginning, that very simple check is a good starting place for things. Knowing what the professionals in a particular area have to say, and only setting that kind of advice aside if you have very good reasons to believe on your own that those professionals are wrong, is not a bad thing. Professionals don't get things right all the time, but they tend to be more right than wrong and more right than amateurs. Doesn't mean they have a lock-on wisdom, but disregarding established professional advice only at your own risk and peril, I think, would be one of the lessons. What's the second basket? The first one is don't do stupid shit. The second would be don't be naive. When I teach foreign policy, I always start off my students with what I call Rose's first law of foreign policy, which is that all policies suck, but some suck more than others. There is no free lunch. Everybody who does policy seriously knows that no options are good, that there's no course of action that promises everything you want, that it's always a choice of trade-offs and alternatives. And at the end of the day, serious professional wisdom in the policy sphere is usually about priorities and trade-offs and accepting lesser evils than about achieving everything you want. In the political sphere, of political discourse, this is of course not true at all, especially in this hyper-partisan era and a highly ideological era. People think, oh, everything I want is good and everything my opponent wants is bad, and they only want the other things because they're too stupid or immoral or whatever, and all we need to do is my answer and that's going to make everything right. That is of course completely untrue. And understanding that in a world of bad choices, the lesser evil choices are the only ones that you should shoot for, and truly accepting that is the start of wisdom. It doesn't give you the answer, but it gives you a good starting point for not having unrealistic expectations and not trying to achieve things that you'll never be able to pull off. It's interesting to me that the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, underestimated and undersold to themselves and to the world, obviously, the costs and risks of going into Iraq. And that the Obama administration did the exact same thing in terms of underselling the costs and risks of going out. Now, whatever you might have thought about the Iraq War on the way in, and whatever you might have thought about the Iraq War on the way out, this was a lousy situation pre-war, it was going to be a lousy situation during the war, and it was going to be a lousy situation post-war. It's a question of balancing which risks and which costs you want to bear, and who is going to suffer what, and what things you can and can't do, and a realistic professional assessment, whatever the discussion was going to be in terms of should we do this or should we do that, was going to mean stomaching something pretty bad, or rather, at least standing by while other people stomach something really bad. And yet, we seem unable during the last decade to have had the kind of honest discussions that reflect real-world practical wisdom of choosing lesser evils. So not being naive, not thinking you're going to get everything, understanding that the Rolling Stones were right when they said you can't always get what you want, but if you try, sometimes you just might find you can get what you need. Understanding the difference between needs and wants. It's odd to think of Mick Jagger as the font of political and policy wisdom, but that is one of the great in this kind of context, the Serenity Prayer, which everyone knows from 12-step things or from their study of Niebuhr or so forth, is one of the great pieces of practical wisdom for policymakers as well. Knowing the difference between what can be changed and affected and what can't be, and having the wisdom to make that choice and the courage to go forward or the strength to bear it up. That is, there's no better piece of prayer that you could have for your policymakers, and having that kind of practical wisdom informed discourse would be great. Finally, understanding where the currents and trends are and which way they're going, and moving with them rather than against them. Moving with the current of your age rather than against it is, I think, very important. And I'll give you just two examples of this. I talked before about globalization and the information technology revolution. What we are seeing, I think, is the progressive expansion of the liberal order that was first put in place, frankly, after World War II. We call it the West. It's now expanded in the post-World War world to a whole variety of places, including non-Western ones. I think the big trend, I'm maybe unusual in this respect, but I'm actually pretty optimistic about the bigger, longer-term trends of history. Things have gotten better. We don't actually worry as much about the kinds of things we shouldn't worry about, but the kind of things we used to worry about in the past, and however bad the dangers are now, they're less bad than a lot of the dangers were previously. We can go into that in the panel if people disagree. But that doesn't mean that you're going to get everywhere very quickly. But it does mean that there are some things that time is against some kinds of structures and institutions and policies. Time is on the side of some. In this whole flat with Russia over Ukraine, the basic driver of this was neither NATO expansion nor Putinist aggression. It was the fact that 20 years after the end of the Eastern Bloc, Poland had managed to leap dramatically ahead by integrating with the West, and its neighbor Ukraine was stuck in stagnant cronyism, a mire of corruption and vassalage, and its people basically were, or a lot of its people were like, hey, we want to be like them. Why did Poland's GDP per capita triple over the last 2 decades and ours not? And so let's try and we want some of what they have. That produces a chain reaction, which ultimately leads Russia, which has no soft power resources whatsoever, only hard power to clamp down, ultimately crack down. It produces this giant crisis we have going on now. But the fundamental driver at the time here is not on Putin's side. The Russian actions in Ukraine are not a replay of the 20s and 30s. They're not an aggressive dictator moving forward. They're more like a replay of the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In Hungary in 56, or Berlin in 61, or Czechoslovakia in 68, or Poland in 81. These are a defensive reaction, trying to clamp down, trying to restrict people in their sphere from going even further out and west. So the Russians in this case are trying to buck historical trends, right? And the long-term prognosis, I would say, for the Russian actions are quite bad. Time is going against them. And the sanctions that we put in place, however wimpy, however much they won't dislodge Ukraine anytime soon, however much they're not going to produce a giant change immediately, are, like they said at the end of Casablanca, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of their lives, are going to actually have a sort of significant constricting effect on Russia, and a sort of pour encouraging les autres, sending a message about what you need to do if you want to be part of a liberal order. So certain kinds of actions flowing with history. 2 other examples of that, and I'll sort of set up the panel just to talk. One is in the Middle East. So just as there are certain trends that you want to put yourself in sync with, there are other ones you want to stay away from because you can't really do much about.